Well, I think on the Buga we're pretty much there. There are a number of data points. You can't carbon date metal, but you can carbon date organic material. Like even if it was a resin, petroleum based or some, like whatnot, because there's carbon atoms in it.
Something strange was uncovered in Colombia, and the moment images hit the internet, the world realized this wasn't another piece of fallen debris. Inside a secure vault, scientists examined a metallic sphere with features no one could easily explain. What researchers found inside the object set off a chain reaction of questions that stretched far beyond the lab. And then Stephen Greer spoke up. The ufologist shared his insight on the Buga sphere and its origin, pushing the mystery into territory nobody expected. The deeper the investigation went, the clearer it became that this discovery wasn't going to fade away quietly. The vault that should not be quiet. The vault had been colder than anyone expected. The kind of cold that made every movement feel deliberate. A single overhead light hung above a padded platform, illuminating the smooth metallic sphere resting at the center of the room. It reflected the faces around it like a distorted mirror, stretching features across its curved surface in a way that unsettled even the most experienced researchers. No one spoke at first. Technicians glanced at one another while monitors hummed quietly along the walls. Resin samples sat in small labeled vials on a nearby steel table, arranged with the careful precision usually reserved for forensic evidence. Every label had already been checked several times. Yet one researcher kept rechecking them, his pen tapping nervously until he realized the noise disrupted the atmosphere. The tiny openings in the sphere's surface drew the most attention. Under magnification, they appeared perfectly round, so uniform that one analyst whispered, "No mistakes, not even a fraction," before catching himself. The markings on the outer shell were faint, emerging only when the light struck at the right angle. They looked carved, yet left no detectable grooves, as if they were part of the metal itself rather than etched into it. A technician leaned in and repeated the temperature reading, even though the automated systems logged every change. He did it out of habit, or maybe out of unease. A researcher with a notebook full of sketches and measurements wrote a short observation about the resin's color. She compared it to aged sap that had been sealed inside a tree long enough to forget the world outside. The team had handled unusual objects before, but this one carried a weight that was hard to describe. It was not the physical mass that mattered, but the sense that the sphere did not belong in the same category as the artifacts normally stored in that vault. It felt older, somehow more deliberate, and disturbingly clean for something that had been exposed to the elements before its recovery. Cables were adjusted, humidity levels monitored, and lighting angles corrected. These small tasks kept hands busy while minds raced ahead. Everyone knew the first round of analysis would begin soon. Yet no one wanted to be the first to break the quiet equilibrium. A younger analyst stepped closer and studied the sphere from only a few inches away, his voice barely above a whisper, as he said, "It looks like a safe with the combination lost." The others found themselves silently agreeing. Whatever the sphere once held, whatever purpose it once served, the answers were sealed somewhere inside that silent metal shell. The vault settled deeper into its cold, steady hum, and the team braced themselves for what the next steps might uncover. What the world first saw. Before the vault, before the lab lights and the cold air, the sphere had already stirred confusion in a place that looked nothing like a scientific facility. It began in Buga, a quiet region surrounded by fields and low hills where people were used to seeing familiar shapes in the sky. Drones, small helicopters, gliders, even weather balloons drifting lazily across the horizon. What appeared that morning did not belong to any of those categories. It moved with a kind of sharp precision, cutting across the sky in a line that looked almost too straight. Residents stepped outside and shaded their eyes, trying to follow its path. A farmer later recalled that it glinted in the sun like polished silver. Another witness, a schoolteacher, said she thought it was a drone until it shifted direction with a sudden turn that felt too crisp and too coordinated. Phones came out, and soon the first shaky clips began spreading online. People paused videos and zoomed into screenshots, trying to make sense of the smooth sphere that reflected the sky around it like a distorted globe. No one quite agreed on how long it remained visible. Some said a few seconds. Others claimed it hovered for nearly a minute before dropping behind a ridge. What they did agree on was the odd feeling it left behind. One man told reporters, "It looked simple, but it did not act simple." The quote circulated quickly. Someone reposted it with the caption, "That is not a balloon," which drew even more attention. The first images of the recovered object came later, after it had been transported and photographed from different angles. The surface appeared seamless, clean, and strangely uniform. The color shifted between silver and muted gray depending on the light. On close inspection, viewers noticed faint markings that looked like symbols or patterns, though no one could say what they represented. People debated everything from ancient scripts to fabrication lines. Yet, none of the markings matched known languages or modern industrial stamps. News outlets filed early reports, some cautious and some sensational. Scientists who were interviewed kept repeating a similar line. They said, "We cannot identify the origin from images alone. Physical testing will be needed." That statement became the anchor point across multiple interviews. It was a way to calm speculation while acknowledging that the object did not resemble something easily classified. Online forums reacted differently. Some insisted it was aerospace debris. Others argued it was a piece of industrial equipment, and some believed it was something entirely new. The sphere had become a blank screen for people to project their theories onto. A few commented that the shape resembled test payloads used in atmospheric studies, though those payloads usually carried seams and connectors, and they rarely looked so deliberately crafted. As the discussion grew, a small detail surfaced that made scientists pay more attention. Several people who saw the sphere up close noted tiny openings scattered across the surface, so consistent in size that they appeared deliberate rather than accidental. These openings were almost invisible in photographs, but became clear when viewed in person. One eyewitness compared them to needle holes on a perfect grid, a description that caught the attention of analysts who specialized in materials engineering. The story gained momentum, and by the following week, researchers from different fields reached out to Colombian officials, asking about transport conditions and possible analysis. Requests for chain of custody documentation began circulating among research teams, some cautious, others enthusiastic. By the time the sphere was moved into a controlled facility, the world had already seen it. Viewers across continents debated its purpose, its shape, and its origin. Yet for all the noise and speculation, one simple fact stood at the center of the storm. The object existed. It had been recovered intact, and no one could explain it with confidence. The world had witnessed the beginning of a mystery long before the first sample ever entered a lab. Inside the lab, where answers begin, the hallway leading to the analysis room had always been quiet, but on the day the sphere arrived, it felt unusually tense. Researchers at the University of Georgia's Center for Applied Isotope Studies moved with a kind of focused urgency, the way people did when they knew they were handling something that might matter far more than they understood. The facility had processed everything from ancient charcoal fragments to botanical remains sealed in ice. Yet the atmosphere surrounding this new sample carried a different weight. The object itself wasn't inside the lab, only the material taken from it. The sphere remained in secure storage, while the resin samples sat in carefully sealed containers marked with tracking codes. They looked small and unimpressive, tiny flakes of amber-colored organic material that could have been tree sap or hardened plant resin. Without context, they appeared ordinary, but their origin gave them an entirely different significance. A technician named Hale, known for his meticulous habits, walked the samples through the initial inspection. He noted their texture, their clarity, and the faint variations in color. The resin had an aged look, something that suggested long-term exposure to natural conditions before it hardened completely. Hale wrote down his observations, though he knew the real answers would come from the mass spectrometer, not from his naked eye. The machine that handled carbon-14 dating was already warming up. Its steady hum filled the room, a sound that never changed, but always conveyed the same promise. Every scientist there understood what the machine could do. Measure the tiny traces of radioactive carbon still left inside organic material and translate it into a number of years. It was a process researchers often compared to checking the fading ink on an ancient timestamp. The clearer the ink, the younger the sample. The fainter the ink, the older it was. A senior analyst named Dr. Marquez reviewed the sample preparation steps while the others worked. She had spent decades analyzing prehistoric materials and rarely reacted to early findings, no matter how intriguing they seemed. Still, she watched the team a little more closely than usual. She could feel the undercurrent of excitement pushing through the room. Once the resin was pre-treated and purified, the first portion entered the instrument. A soft click signaled the start. The team settled into a patient silence, the kind trained scientists used when waiting for a measurement they couldn't influence. It didn't matter how unusual the sphere looked or where people believed it came from. The dating process had its own rhythm, and the results would appear only when the machine was ready. During the wait, one of the junior researchers tried to break the tension with a comment. She said the resin reminded her of honey trapped in an ancient pot, the kind archaeologists sometimes found when excavating burial sites. Another researcher smiled and said that this resin might be old enough to beat any pot that had ever been found. They laughed quietly, then let the room slip back into its steady hum. When the preliminary numbers finally appeared, Marquez leaned in. Her expression didn't shift dramatically, but the slight lift of her eyebrows told everyone the reading wasn't ordinary. She read the data again, then checked the calibration log just to be certain. Hale hovered behind her, holding his breath. The age estimate placed the resin somewhere around 12,560 years before present. The number sat on the screen, simple and unflinching, the kind of number that forced a room to reorganize its thoughts. They all understood what it meant. This resin had formed at the end of the Pliocene during the Younger Does, a period better known for melting ice sheets and shifting climates than for crafted metallic objects. The team didn't jump to conclusions. They reviewed the sample handling, checked for possible contamination, and repeated the core steps, but the number remained consistent. Whatever the sphere was, whatever purpose it once had, at least some part of it carried the age of a world that had looked nothing like the one outside the lab doors. By the end of the session, the room felt different. The quiet wasn't tense anymore. It was contemplative. The numbers had given them a starting point, a hint, a doorway, and they knew the next steps would only pull them deeper into the mystery, the unexpected complication. While the lab team worked through the first round of measurements, the story outside the facility took an unexpected turn. It began with a simple message passed between researchers, the kind that usually carried routine updates. This time, the tone felt different. Someone mentioned an attempted visit by men who presented themselves as police officers, a detail that immediately raised questions. The claim came from Stephen Greer's side, not from any verified official source. Yet it circulated quickly enough to make people pause. According to the account, the men had approached a location connected to the sphere and asked for access. They wore uniforms and carried themselves with the confidence of authority, but something about the interaction felt wrong to the people present. Details varied depending on who recounted the story, and without a formal police record, it remained one step short of confirmed. Still, the idea alone shifted the atmosphere around the case. Researchers who had already been cautious became even more aware of the sensitivity surrounding the object. Inside the lab, the scientists kept their focus on measurable facts. Yet, they could not completely ignore the tension rising around them. Dr. Marquez, who normally avoided conversations that leaned into speculation, quietly reminded the team that unusual claims tended to attract unusual attention. She had seen similar situations with controversial samples in the past. Whenever a finding seemed to challenge established expectations, outside pressure often followed, and Stephen Greer, the renowned ufologist, was not the kind of man who ever let speculation slide. The analysts went back to their work, but the complication lingered in the back of everyone's mind. Hale reviewed the chain of custody on the resin samples again, making sure every step was recorded with exact clarity. It felt necessary. The more attention the sphere received, the more important it became to ensure every detail was documented. Scientific work depended on trust, and trust depended on precise records. Meanwhile, the online conversation continued to evolve. Some commentators took the rumor of the fake police visit as further proof that the sphere held something extraordinary. Others dismissed it as a misunderstanding or an exaggeration. Journalists asked for confirmations, but none appeared. The facility itself said nothing publicly, which added even more fuel to the speculation. Despite the noise outside, the work continued with methodical precision. Each test, each measurement, each calibration was treated as a piece of a puzzle that none of them wanted to misplace. They understood that the sphere attracted attention not just for its physical appearance, but for the silence surrounding its purpose. Objects that refused easy explanation always carried a certain magnetism. A complication also raised a more practical concern. If individuals were trying to access the sphere through unofficial channels, even if the story remained unverified, the team needed to consider security more seriously. Marquez met with facility administrators to review access procedures and monitoring protocols. Nothing dramatic needed to change, but tightening certain points helped the team feel grounded in their work. By the end of the week, the researchers had settled into a rhythm that balanced scientific focus with growing outside interest. The strange rumor never solidified into an official statement, yet it had already shaped the narrative around the sphere. It created a sense that the object stood at the center of competing expectations, scientific curiosity on one side and public speculation on the other. The complication did not provide answers, but it added a new layer to the mystery. And as the team prepared to move into deeper phases of analysis, they understood one thing clearly. Whatever came next, the sphere story was no longer confined to the lab. It was being shaped by forces far beyond the walls around them. When interpretation finally entered the room, the lab could measure age, material, contamination risk, and a dozen other things. But it could not offer meaning. Meaning arrived later in the form of interpretations, statements, and the public voices that tried to connect the numbers to a larger story. Among those voices, Stephen Greer became one of the most discussed. As the resin results circulated, people began asking what the findings suggested about the strange metallic object and where it might have come from. That question opened the door for Greer to speak publicly about the Buga and its origin, and his comments shifted the conversation in a way the lab team could not ignore. His explanation began with the date. He emphasized that the organic resin pulled from the microscopic openings inside the sphere had been radiocarbon tested, and that the date hovered around 12,560 years. He pointed out that this placed the material in the late Pliocene, long before the rise of early civilizations usually associated with metalworking. It was a simple observation, but it carried weight. The number forced people to picture a world covered in melting ice sheets and shifting climates, while imagining a crafted metallic object sitting somewhere within that landscape. Greer described the age as older than the pyramids by more than 10,000 years. And he repeated that the resin was organic, not metallic, which meant the sphere itself had not been dated directly. Even so, he argued that the presence of ancient resin inside the carefully drilled micro-opening suggested that at least one component of the object belonged to a time when humanity's known technological capabilities did not include such precise fabrication. The researchers following the public commentary noted that Greer kept his language measured when he addressed the sphere's potential origin. He did not claim proof of anything, but he did raise the possibility that the structure of the openings, the engravings, and the advanced uniformity of the metal could hint at a non-human manufacturer. It was an interpretation rather than a conclusion. But interpretations had a way of spreading faster than data. Inside the lab, Dr. Marquez read the statements with cautious interest. She understood the appeal of broad explanations when evidence felt incomplete. Scientists sought clarity, and when clarity was delayed, others filled the gap with their own frameworks. Hale commented quietly that the reactions were predictable. When an object arrived with no clear cultural context and no obvious technological lineage, people naturally divided into two camps. One group assumed there had to be a human explanation waiting to be uncovered. The other group leaned into the unknown. Greer's statements landed somewhere in the middle. He acknowledged the need for further verification while presenting the age as a potentially transformative detail. Journalists quoted him frequently, repeating his remarks about the sphere's unusual structure and the implications of the resin's date. Some articles framed his comments as a cautious analysis, others as a bold suggestion, depending on how sensational the outlet wanted the story to appear. Meanwhile, independent researchers requested access to the raw data, hoping to evaluate the methodology themselves. Some wanted to compare the resin composition to documented ancient materials. Others wanted to examine whether environmental contamination could mimic an older date. The push for transparency grew, and with it, the recognition that the sphere had moved from an unexplained artifact to an object under global scrutiny. Something had shifted. The age had been established, but the interpretation had only begun. Aftermath and the questions that would not settle. The days that followed felt quieter. The lab had returned to its usual rhythm. But the people inside it had not. The resin's age, the public attention, and the wave of interpretations created a landscape where every new decision needed to be taken with care. In the facility's meeting room, Dr. Marquez reviewed the compiled data with the rest of the team. Nothing in their measurements contradicted the radiocarbon result, but nothing explained the structure of the sphere either. It was a strange position to occupy. They had a clear number, a verified age for the resin, yet no cultural or technological framework that connected it to any known human tradition from that period. The scientists focused on what could be established, not on what people hoped to believe. Outside the lab, reactions continued to evolve. Some researchers from other institutions requested access to the raw data. Others questioned whether environmental contamination could have influenced the age. The debates were grounded in science, and the team welcomed them because challenges were part of the process. At the same time, the sphere drew interest from people who wanted answers that science could not yet provide. Videos circulated, interviews spread, and discussions about origin grew louder than the technical conversations that produced the original findings. Even as attention increased, the team remained grounded in their work. They planned further testing, material examination, and independent review. None of them expected fast answers. The sphere's surface, its markings, its precision, and the ancient resin inside created a collection of clues that offered more questions than conclusions. When the lights dimmed at the end of another long day, Marquez paused by the secured storage unit where the sphere sat in silence. She understood that the mystery surrounding it would not settle soon. Whatever path the investigation took, the object had already changed the people studying it, and it had reminded them of something important. The world still held discoveries capable of reshaping old assumptions, even when the truth remained just beyond reach. What do you think about this discovery? Do you believe the Buga has a terrestrial explanation, or does it have foreign origins? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next.